Good afternoon and welcome to Cut to the Chase with Senator Chase. Happy Friday, everyone. I hope you're driving home after your long work week. This is your weekly call-in town hall and radio show. I will be on the air for the next hour to answer any questions, or you can just listen in. I'm here each Friday from 6 to 7 p.m. You can tune in, listen in, call in. And if you would like to express your thoughts on some of the issues that we'll be talking about, I have the phone number here, and you can write this down. It's 804-454-1366, and I'm going to tell you again, 804-454-1366. And, I really want to thank WNTW for the opportunity to provide this free public service to you each week. It's a unique opportunity for you, and I hope you will take advantage of it. Again, I'm State Senator Amanda Chase. I'm your weekly radio show host. I serve you at the state level, not to be confused with the federal level, which meets in D.C., and my office is at the state capitol in downtown Richmond. This is still my first term in office. I have a 4-year term, and next session will be my final term before I run for re-election next year. I represent the 11th Senatorial District, which includes all of Amelia, all of Colonial Heights, and most of Chesterfield, which is actually where I grew up. I'm a Christian, conservative, Republican, and in that order. Vice President Mike Pence used that line, and I liked it so much that I like to borrow it from him. When I ran for office, I ran on term-limiting career politicians and returning the government back to the people. And my goal is to be a representative who is transparent, accessible, and approachable. I would like to say I'm not paid to do this show. I do it because I think it's important to stay connected to the people that I serve, and so I hope you'll take advantage of it. Since being elected in 2015, I push for greater transparency, accountability, and accessibility in state government. Legislation that returns the power back to the people. I serve on 4 committees: Health and Education, Transportation, Local Governments, and Privileges and Elections. And so that's mostly where my expertise lies. But I also co-founded the Transparency Caucus, which worked in a bipartisan and bicameral way to ensure that committee meetings are streamed and recorded to give constituents greater access to the actual work of the legislature. And you can actually go to virginiageneralassembly.gov, and you can find out all kinds of information on there. But for the first time in Virginia's history, you can now view the work sessions or committee meetings of all the committee meetings that take place when the General Assembly convenes during the regular session. So you'll have to tune into that. And actually, they're recorded. So it's kind of a big deal. Many of the topics that we address on our show are issues that constituents have brought to my attention, or issues that we've addressed in the General Assembly, which generally meets January through March. From time to time, we also get congressional updates from our Congress here, Congressman Dave Bratt. And if you have a question about today's topic, I invite you to call in. And again, the number is 804-454-1366. And I'll do my best to answer your question on the show. Some of you have called in and asked me to comment on, and I'm going to have to do some research on, there was one about the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry and concerns that our medications are actually killing us. And so I know the gentleman that called in. I just want to reassure you that I am going to read that book. I'm not ready to talk about it on the show, but I will be talking about that at some point, so stay tuned. It has been a busy week. I don't know about you, but I was out last Saturday going door to door with Congressman Dave Bratt and John Childrey, who is running for Commonwealth's attorney here in Chesterfield County. And we were going through the Hawsley subdivision. And so it was great seeing a lot of our neighbors in that area. And it's such a friendly neighborhood, too, by the way. That Saturday, we also went to the Family Foundation Gala with Chris Scalia and Mike Ferris, and had a good time at that event. Of course, we were celebrating finally the nomination of now Justice Kavanaugh. So everybody was celebrating last Saturday night. And certainly good news, in my opinion, for conservatives. And just a reminder, remember that on Tuesday, November the 6th, you're going to go to the polls and vote. And the polls will be open from 6 a.m. until 7 p.m. You have until Monday, this coming Monday, October the 15th, to register to vote. And I especially want you to think about the kids in high school that will be turning 18 before November the 6th. Get them to the registrar's office. You can just do a Google search for county registrar in your county. I would go in person just to make sure it's all taken care of. They're usually open from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. I know the one here in Chesterfield is right near the county administrator building off of Iron Bridge Road. So you'll definitely want to make sure you get your high schoolers registered to vote. Or if you're new to the area and still haven't registered to vote, or maybe you need to update. Maybe you've moved and you need to update your voter registration card. So go ahead and take care of that. So this past Monday, I attended Congressman Dave Bratt's Oktoberfest at Hardywood Brewery, and it was an incredible turnout. There were several hundred people there, and it was a great turnout. Tuesday of this week, we had a coal ash special subcommittee meeting in which Senator Surville and I basically listened with the subcommittee to hear from other stakeholders, vendors that are looking to submit RFPs so that recycling vendors, and I've talked about this on the show before, but there was a bill that Senator Surville and I co-patroned together that would basically take care of the problem of what we do with all of this coal ash. And we have the Chesterfield Power Plant, which is located in southern Chesterfield. And there are mountains and mountains of coal ash there. And the coal ash is sitting in mostly unlined ponds. And so our concern is that, we're having hexavalent chromium and radon and arsenic and all kinds of elements which are not good for humans, and some of them have been shown to be known carcinogens. We're working to make sure that there's some type of barrier between the coal ash, the toxic coal ash, and the ground water. So the federal EPA allows them to just simply cap in place, kind of put a kind of like a tarp over it and put some landscaping on it. But I don't think that does enough. I mean, that's what they're allowed to do according to the EPA. But we're finding that there's still contamination. And so I think that Virginia needs to join the other states, the East Coast states that are excavating the coal ash, like South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia. Coal ash is, by the way, a byproduct of electricity. If you're turning on a light, you're producing coal ash. So every time you flip on that light, it produces a little bit of coal ash right there. So we're all kind of contributing to the problem. And Dominion has not violated any state or federal laws, by the way. So anyway, so stay tuned on that. We're basically looking for them to excavate the coal ash. That's kind of Senator Surville and I have agreed that's what we'd like for the law to look like. They would be required to excavate the coal ash, but to offset that cost, because Dominion won't pay for that. Okay, that'll be in a rate adjustment clause. We want to minimize that cost. So what we've done is we're asking Dominion to get the cost of recycling the coal ash to see if we can offset that cost so that the ratepayer, not the taxpayer. A lot of people get confused and they say, is the taxpayer having to pay for this? No, the ratepayer, the people that actually use the electricity, will be the ones that pay for this. So I also met this week with a number of small business owners, car dealerships, and we talked about franchise issues. I've attended in Colonial Heights. There was a GOP meet and greet for Ryan McAdams, who is the Republican nominee for the 4th Congressional District, challenging Don McEachin, who is the current congressman. And then I also attended on Wednesday a Chesterfield Council of Aging's legislative forum, and we shared insights on legislation which impacts older adults, 50 and older, and we provided opportunities for Chesterfield County citizens to ask questions. Friday, today, this morning, I was actually here in Chesterfield at a Dental Hygienist Association. They had their annual conference and what they call House of Delegates. They had their convention, and so Senator Sturdivant and I were able to speak to that group. So it's been a busy week, busy week. And next week is just going to be just as busy, and I won't go into great detail, but I'll be at a Virginia Education Summit for 2 days, and lots going on next week. We've got a debate. We have a nurses legislative reception, and we have a Chesterfield Chamber ribbon cutting open house. So anyway, stay tuned. We'll be back with more Cut to the Chase. All right, welcome back to more Cut to the Chase with State Senator Amanda Chase. And just a reminder, on Monday evening, you want to mark your calendar from 6:30 to 8:30. There is the Brat Spanberger's 7th Congressional District debate, and it is going to be live from Culpeper. The Culpeper Chamber of Commerce is hosting the 90-minute debate, for which tickets are no longer available, by the way. But the public also will be able to watch the debate at the Culpeper Media Network station on Main Street. In addition, C-SPAN has reportedly said they will air the debate either live or at a later time. Culpeper Media Network station manager Jonathan Krawchuk is going to moderate. The debate will be broadcast live on CBS, CBS 6, Comcast 206, Verizon 466, over the air, and available for live stream on both WTVR.com and the CBS 6 Facebook page. We have U.S. Representative Dave Bratt, who is a Republican from Henrico, and Democratic challenger Abigail Spanberger of Glen Allen. They will face off at 6:30 p.m. Monday at Germanna Community College's Danielle Technology Center. So you'll want to put that on your calendar. So today we are going to be talking about an issue which has been on my Facebook post. I post about these different workshops and different things that I go to during the week. And sometimes from those Facebook posts, many of you all have questions, or sometimes we can end up with a heated debate, which is what we ended up on my Facebook page, my Senator Amanda Chase page, getting a lot of attention and publicity on it. And what I want to talk to you about today is an issue having to do with conversion therapy. Now, many of you are saying, what is conversion therapy and why is that important? If free speech is important to you and political correctness, you feel like should not dominate public policy, you need to listen to today's topic that we're going to be talking about, because that's what we're really facing today. We are discussing free speech, and as it relates to the political world and conversion therapy. Now, some of you are going to say, what is conversion therapy? And I've got Sean Maguire, who is the director of Grassroots from the Family Foundation of Virginia. And he is with me here on the air right now. Sean, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you for having me, Senator Chase.
Well, thank you for coming on today. So, Sean, we have seen several bills in the General Assembly. I know it came before the committee on which I sit, Senate Health and Education, and it was a bill that I know in the Senate was sponsored by Senator Scott Survell, who is someone that I know very well and have worked with on actually our coal ash legislation together, and we're friendly and allies on coal ash issues. But this is one issue that we obviously disagree on, but we're able to respectfully sit down and talk about it. Interestingly, after our coal ash meeting that we had, where we really worked very closely together, I asked him to come to my office so we could talk about the conversion therapy work group that we had this past week. And just so our listeners know, conversion therapy is aimed at changing sexual orientation. And so some have said that it's ineffective and potentially harmful. A lot of the medical professional organizations say that it's still legal in most of the country, including Virginia, and there's been an effort to outlaw its use on minors by licensed professionals over the past 5 years. But their efforts have been thwarted by our Virginia General Assembly, where a bill has consistently failed to get past committees on party line votes. But last week, and I mentioned this last week, but Virginia's regulatory boards were trying to, in my opinion, bypass what the General Assembly had said that they didn't feel was appropriate. And so a lot of times, and this is unfortunate that this happens, boards will try to use regulations to get what they couldn't get through legislation. And I think it's a very dangerous precedent here. So the Department of Health Professions held a conversion therapy work group last Friday to consider potential regulations that its different boards, such as the Board of Medicine and the Board of Psychology, could enact to prohibit conversion therapy on those under 18 by a clinician licensed by the state. The idea of prohibiting the practice through regulations was brought up by legislators during General Assembly sessions, according to Dr. David Brown, who's the director of Department of Health Professions, promoting the work group's formation. The heads of the boards largely agreed that regulations are necessary, and the next step would be to discuss the proposed language during their respective board meetings over the next several months. Yeah. Now, conversion therapy is defined as treating a patient in an attempt to intentionally change his or her sexual orientation or gender identity. And in the past, it includes practices such as electric shock therapy, which Herb Stewart, who is the chairman of the Board of Psychology, said can only be described as torture. We don't support that, so I want to be very clear.
Right.
We don't.
Absolutely.
And in fact, today it's a form of counseling and psychotherapy aimed at eliminating patients' sexual desires. It is also referred to as sexual orientation change efforts. And Sean, you were there as well as I was. There was a vehement opinions on both sides as more than 24 people spoke during a public comment period that lasted more than 90 minutes at last Friday's meeting. And there were lots of personal stories of how conversion therapy helped them, or how it, in many cases, did boundless harm that took years or decades to heal. And you represented the Family Foundation at that particular event. And a lot of the faith organizations claim that conversion therapy is a form of free speech and that prohibiting its practice is denying religious counselors the ability to affirm natural sexual expressions, as one opponent of banning the practice said. Tell us a little bit, first of all, about your personal story.
Yeah, so it was right up my alley when I heard about this conversion therapy regulation work group, because I grew up in the church, in a Christian family with strong biblical values, but I also grew up with same-sex sexual attractions and romantic attractions towards the same sex. So my experience has always been with these kinds of desires as I pursued following what I believe to be the truth about God's moral and ethical obligations for me as a man. Throughout my childhood and youth, as I was experiencing these desires, my family, of course, encouraged me to pursue Christ. And part of that did include some work with some counselors in high school. And also I went to a group that's called No Longer Active, but it was one of the leaders of what's known as conversion therapy, and it was Exodus International. And, you know, my experiences in these places with these counselors and these groups never reflected the kind of testimony that I heard last Friday. I experienced, the care that was shown from older people who really wanted to protect me and help me to live a life well as I was growing up with these desires. I never was referred to in a way that would indicate that I needed to change my identity. I was always treated with respect that I should be able to pursue the truth and follow Christ the way I the way anyone else would, no matter what my desires were.
Now, I know in some of the comments of people that were against the conversion therapy, they said their opposition was about the shaming component. Did you experience any type of shaming when you went through the program?
It was not. I didn't have extensive involvement with any program per se, but I never experienced shame on this issue growing up because I think my family just modeled that so well to me that they showed by their actions and by their words that no matter what anyone has a struggle with or desires for, they're never to be treated as less than human, and everyone is equally dignified before God. And that attitude
Sean,
protected me from any shame.
Sean, thanks so much for sharing. And Sean's going to be right back. We're going to a break, and then we'll be right back with Sean Maguire. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to more Cut to the Chase with State Senator Amanda Chase, and we're talking about very controversial subject, conversion therapy. Opponents on both sides, I mean, you've got different opinions on both sides of this issue, and some people say, well, why can't you just accept this? But, not everybody wants to, how would you say this? They feel like their belief system is one thing and they're feeling something else. So they want those two to align. And we should allow people to get the help that they want. I'm all for freedom. I'm all for choice. And so we don't want to shut down that conversation if someone wants to get help. And so Sean Maguire here is the Grassroots coordinator for the Family Foundation, and he was just sharing his story about feelings of what we call sexual dysphoria. And I was just going to ask you, Sean, after you shared your testimony, how did people respond to you after you testified there?
Well, it was interesting. There were a lot of people there who were advocating for these regulations to protect minors and to protect others who would be shamed. And we were talking about the importance of, the shame component is so big here. And so after I shared, I got several questions from people who were they were very much confused that I was there talking about my own experience and yet opposing regulations that would ban conversion therapy. And one of the best stories is when I was actually at a different event sharing on a similar topic, one of the advocates of LGBTQ plus rights came up to me and he asked me, have you ever even met someone who experiences this? And I was like, yeah, I am one. And he just looked at me and he said, why are you on their side? And I was able to explain that to him. So, the last week as I was sharing with people after the testimony period, they talked to me about why are you opposing these regulations? They're going to protect people like you. And I was like, no. See, that's the issue. People like me. See, enshrining an LGBTQ plus identity through regulations or through a law would make it so that I am not the same as other men recognized by the law. I would be distinct, not based on any, observable trait, but based only on desire. If our identity becomes rooted in experienced desires or attractions or our understanding of gender, then we have created a different type of person under the law, and I oppose that. I think we need to be very careful to protect equality under the law.
Very good. What is your response to those who would argue that you should be in support of this regulation since you yourself might be the target of these kinds of harmful treatments?
Again, I would just reinforce that these treatments are only harmful. They only bring shame. And they bring shame because of the adoption of a false identity. So I would respond by saying that's not who I am. I can't have conversion from one identity to the other because this isn't my identity. It's only my desire, and that's such a different issue.
No, I know one thing that you had said at the meeting was, I quote, "My position is embracing the idea that LGBTQ plus identity is a category of humanity. It's where the real harm is done."
Right.
And then you go on to say, don't take away the freedom of religious counselors to share the truth about what they deeply believe is the truth of human nature. There were a lot of people, Sean, there, some opponents of the practice, pointed to the fact that numerous professional organizations state that conversion therapy is medically useless and in some cases dangerous.
Yeah.
Many gave their personal testimonies of their experience. And in fact, one gentleman there, Adam Tremor, said, conversion therapy broke my identity down to nothing. He was treated with therapy as a teen, and he said he attempted suicide and that it took him years to get past the resulting change, and even said nobody should have to go through therapy because of therapy. What are your comments to that?
Yeah, and I agree with Adam Tremor so much on that. No one should go through therapy because of therapy. That is true. And it is awful that he was ever subjected to the kind of treatments that he was. I would say to that, this is an indication that there are clinicians out there who exercise really bad tactics. They don't do what's best for their clients, and they expose them, or they treat them in such a way that causes harm. It doesn't bring good. That's tragic.
I agree. And, that's something,
we all oppose that kind of thing.
We do not support, just to be clear, any type of mental or physical abuse at all, which is a lot of the folks were saying, conversion therapy is abuse. And, I can argue as a legislator, okay, I can take anything that's a bad bill, bad piece of legislation, and I can take it out. You can amend it. We do that in the General Assembly all the time. We amend it. We amend a bill. We put a substitution in there. We can do whatever we want. And people who are not legislators are inclined to think once it's that way in stone, it's always that way. But that's what we do as legislators.
You asked a question at the beginning of this conversation to your listener. A lot of listeners are asking, what is conversion therapy? And that's kind of the important question. You've read a definition, I think, that comes from, a popular culture source of, conversion therapy is an effort to change sexual orientation or gender identity. That the legislation that's been proposed says any practice toward that end, and the definition of conversion therapy leaves a lot to be desired. It's not clear exactly what practices would or would not be prohibited by these kinds of regulations. And because it's so broad and far-reaching, we're not just going to impact those dangerous and harmful practices that, those who testified shared about. We're going to impact anything that is going to affirm the natural relationship between men and women.
And on that note, Sean, we will be right back after the break. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back to more Cut to the Chase with Senator Chase and Sean Maguire. Here we are talking about the controversial subject of conversion therapy. The bill was basically killed in the subcommittee and committee in the House and the Senate. And we're having the discussion over whether regulation should be further perpetrated when the General Assembly has basically said, no, we do not support banning conversion therapy. So that was the challenge we had with this work group. The members of the work group who represented an array of state licensing boards, they all said that the testimonies that they heard from both sides were compelling. I thought, Sean, it was really interesting. In the Senate Health and Ed meeting, committee meeting, which we heard hours of testimony on both sides. Many of the same people testified, and I think there was some confusion over why they were there, because the whole purpose of that meeting was to decide whether we needed regulation or not over conversion therapy. And one of the concerns that I expressed at the beginning of the meeting was to remind the work group where the General Assembly stands on the issue, since a bill banning the therapy had been consistently killed. And it was almost like I got the impression that they thought they were going to step in where the General Assembly didn't do what they wanted them to do, and go through and listen to testimony on both sides and come up with some regulations that did what the General Assembly did not do. So I was a little bit irritated by that. And I would also say that one of the things that I am concerned about is the unintended consequences of prohibiting conversion therapy through regulation. And it could be that parents don't bring their kids to get professional help.
Right.
Some parents believe, along with their kids, that homosexuality is a sin, and they need options. I mean, let's respect people's religious faith here instead of shoving our own political agendas down people's throats. We have to respect that there are people who are faith people, religious people, who may also are honest enough to express they have these feelings, and they want their desires to match what they feel in their heart is their deeply held religious belief. And no one should be able to force their political belief system on another individual. That's for that other individual to decide. They discuss the wording of the proposed regulations to make it clear that the prohibition would be specifically on a practitioner aiming to change their patient's sexual orientation or gender identity. And, that was frustrating to me because I felt like the work group was acting outside of the parameters in which they should have been operating. And now I had to leave. I stayed there for several hours. The meeting went on and on. Tell us, Sean, how did the work group conclude, and what are the next steps?
So the work group concluded, as director David Brown, I believe it was David Brown, concluded that they had a consensus from the members of the work group, which are most of the boards, the regulatory boards, and a few other practitioners from these different sectors. But they concluded that there's a consensus without unanimous agreement that regulations are probably necessary. So they're going to write to each of these boards and encourage them to draft the regulations themselves, so Board of Psychology, Board of Social Work, et cetera. You mentioned that at the beginning of the program. And that's what we're looking at now, and we'll be watching to see if any of these boards do indeed propose regulations. There will be another opportunity for public comment and input before they proceed.
Now, I thought it was pretty interesting. First of all, I believe wholeheartedly that those regulations should be parallel and in the same spirit of the laws that the General Assembly does or does not pass. But I thought there was a Supreme Court ruling. It was NEFLA versus Becerra. And free speech wins, basically. The Supreme Court ruled that pregnancy centers can't be forced to advertise for abortion. Let's talk about the precedent that case sets.
Absolutely. Yeah, so that case was about forcing pro-life pregnancy resource centers to advertise for state-funded abortions in that state. So this is very similar in kind because this regulation also requires clinicians to only express one viewpoint. It really does. It allows the exploration of sexual identity in one way, but not the other. So the language from NIFLA v. Becerra was so strong, and if you don't mind, I'd love to read an excerpt from the opinion. So in the excerpt from Justice Anthony Kennedy, who concurred with the decision, he says, "The California legislature included in its official history the congratulatory statement that the act was part of California's legacy of forward thinking. But it is not forward thinking to force individuals to be an instrument for fostering public adherence to an ideological point of view they find unacceptable. It is forward thinking to begin by reading the First Amendment as ratified in 1791, to understand the history of authoritarian government as the founders then knew it, to confirm that history since then shows how relentless authoritarian regimes are in their attempts to stifle free speech, and to carry those lessons onward as we seek to preserve and teach the necessity of freedom of speech for the generations to come. Governments must not be allowed to force persons to express a message contrary to their deepest convictions. Freedom of speech secures freedom of thought and belief. This law imperils those liberties."
Well, we wholeheartedly agree with that opinion. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Supreme Court case, it was two things. It was a California law that not only required, number one, pregnancy centers to advertise for abortion. Pregnancy centers typically don't support abortion, by the way. They support and help women who get pregnant, and it's a way to help and support them and affirm them and give them an alternative to abortion. So it violates even the existence of why they're around. They're showing people there's another way. But secondly, it also attempted to crowd out the pro-life message in advertising altogether. So under the law, pregnancy centers that were not medically licensed by the state were required to post a disclaimer in their centers and in their advertising. This is just crazy. That they are not a medical facility in up to 13 different languages. And the requirement made it virtually impossible for them to advertise their services or even to advertise a simple pro-life message. Justice Kennedy pointed out the absurdity of this requirement in oral arguments back this past March. He said, what would happen if the unlicensed center just had a billboard that said, choose life? Would they have to make the disclosure, he asked? And the answer was yes.
Yeah.
That center would be required to post a disclaimer on that billboard in the same size font as choose life and up to 13 different languages, completely drowning out the pro-life message. So the court's opinion also highlighted this concern, and the court's decision makes it very clear that the government must respect pro-life beliefs in this case. But really, it doesn't matter if you're pro-life or pro-abortion. Today's ruling is a win for us all, in that it assures that the government, and this is huge here, the government cannot force anyone to express a message against their convictions.
Exactly. And the regulations that are at question today here on the conversion therapy issue, it's an ideological point of view. It is a question that goes to the very heart of the nature of humanity, which is an ideological position. And the state it's inappropriate for the state to compel anyone to hold a particular view of human nature. Now, one thing that California argued was that these regulations could work because it's professional speech and not, the normal kind of free speech. But the Supreme Court rejected that argument. So just because we're looking at regulating counselors and licensed practitioners, whether it's in medicine or therapy, that doesn't make a difference. Their free speech protections must be upheld.
And so once again, we emphasize the importance of our First Amendment free speech rights. And if you are a counselor, and let's say you're a Christian counselor, and you object morally, to that you want your belief system to match up with, and you want to help people to do that. You shouldn't be forced by the government to say no. I can't help you with this. Right,
exactly, and it goes all the way to the nature of humanity. A counselor who's a Christian wouldn't be able to declare their position on the nature of human beings as male and female image bearers of the Holy God. With this regulation in place, that could be construed as an effort to change someone's sexual orientation. Somebody wrote about that in a story that they shared about how they had a coach someone who told them that about the anatomical structure of reproduction. That could be construed as conversion therapy.
All right, we'll be right back with Sean Maguire. Stay tuned. All right, we're back for the final wrap-up of Cut to the Chase with Senator Chase. It was great being with you all today, and appreciate certainly Sean Maguire of the Family Foundation for coming on the show and talking about such a personal subject, but just appreciate his willingness to share his thoughts on this. Sean, we've already faced this kind of legislation this past session and even in years past.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about the likelihood that this kind of regulation would be passed by the General Assembly this coming session?
Well, I want to talk about why, the Family Foundation has opposed this. Every year it's come forward, and successfully we've seen it defeated time and again. We oppose it for so many reasons, not just because of, the implications it has on marriage, parental authority, religious liberty, and constitutional government. Like, those are 4 out of our 5 core principles. And because the legislature hasn't changed at all in its makeup in between last year and this year, I don't see how it could pass.
Well, I don't either. I have been talking with Senator Servell about language changes. I would sign a bill in a heartbeat that got rid of any of this physical harm that they're talking about. That, in my opinion, and what I've seen, it's not used anymore.
Right. I do want to say one thing. During a previous permutation of this idea, Senator Donovan was speaking out about it in the subcommittee or committee hearing, pointing out that electroshock therapy is actually a valid form of therapy in some medical efforts. And, she's a doctor who knows more about that than I do. I wasn't aware of that. But I just want to point out that the language can be so overreaching that it will block and prevent good therapies when they're trying to prevent the bad ones. And I just want to say that it's already a requirement of professional conduct in this Commonwealth that you have to use evidence-based therapies. And so the ones that they're arguing against as being so harmful, they're already under that regulation, and it just needs to be enforced. It needs to be reported, searched out, and enforced.
It's funny you should mention that. The one question I ask of the work group is, how many cases in Virginia, has the state of Virginia, how many cases of abuse have been reported? And the answer was a big fat 0, goose egg, none.
Right. And it shocked me when they concluded there's consensus that we should regulate, but there's no reported complaints.
And it's a problem.
Yep.
Looking for a solution. And I just don't think that's how we should be legislating policy in the state of Virginia. Sean, thank you so much for coming on Cut to the Chase with Senator Chase today. Greatly appreciate your willingness to share your personal story with us. Greatly appreciated, and I'm sure our listeners appreciate it as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Very good. Well, thank you again for joining us today on Cut to the Chase with Senator Chase here on WNTW The Answer. I hope you join us again next Friday for our weekly town hall from 6 to 7 p.m. as I answer your questions, get your input, and address issues that are important to you. If you would like notices of upcoming events, town halls, or my weekly newsletter, visit my website at chase4senate.com and sign up. During session, I send out a weekly update, and each Friday and out of session, we send out a monthly newsletter. Or you can always join us each Friday here on WNTW AM 820. The Answer on Cut to the Chase with Senator Chase. And until next week, we'll see you then. Next week, we are going to be talking about education. And so you'll want to be tuning in about that. I will be attending a 2-day conference regarding education. It's an education summit that's put on by Senator Steve Newman and Senator Delegate Landis. And so I will be attending that for 2 days. So I look forward to coming back to you with what all we learned. A lot of great discussion is going to take place on that as we talk about what we can do to improve Virginia's schools. So you want to stay tuned. Next week, we'll be back. Have a great week.